Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. I welcome you from one of Carleton University's many remote campuses, otherwise known as my kitchen. You know, we're just so impressed and amazed right now. We had over 350 people register for this important conversation. So thank you for making time and investing in our profession and in Canadian society by being part of this discussion. We're just so grateful. Now, as you know, we are recording this session today, which will ensure we have even greater impact. So for those who couldn't join us live, it will be recorded, presented on our website, and promoted through social media as well. I will remind you that although this is a virtual event, it's still a live event. So we do hope that it is smooth, but not too scripted, just like a real in-person event. Your microphones and cameras are off, but not to worry. During the question and answer period, we want to make a nice interactive session. They will be activated at that time. We're just so pleased to be joined by our donors, our alumni, our partners, and all of our stakeholders, our board members, and fundraising professionals and not-for-profit leaders, literally from across the country. You know, partnership and community engagement are pillars of the ethos for Carleton University, a big part of our mission. But as we find ourselves in these challenging and oft replied unprecedented times, you know, we've really seen that partnership is even more critical so that we can get through this situation together as partners, not just participants. In the coming weeks and months and years, we'll face complex global issues as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, as we well know. Issues really that can only effectively be addressed through partnership and collaborative effort. We're glad to have you with us. That's why we're just so proud today to present this event via our brand new Hub for Good, Carleton's new digital space for collaborators and partnerships so we can facilitate better dialogue and better relationships with our broader community. Together, we can do a lot of good, and we hope you will join us in this good work. If you're interested, and yes, this is the commercial part, if you are interested in collaborating and partnering with us, we'd love to hear from you. We are seeking partnership. Visit the Hub for Good, hubforgood.carleton.ca, and let's chat about what we can co-create together. Today, our session, and aren't we lucky, it will be moderated by Mr. Keith Sjogren. Keith is the Managing Director at Investor Economics, a leading provider of research and advisory services to the financial services industry. Educated at Carleton University, yes, he's a proud Raven, and the University of Toronto also. Keith is a fellow of the Institute of Canadian Bankers and holds the Partners, Directors, Officers qualification of the Canadian Securities Institute. Keith, of course, is the chair of our advisory council for our Masters in Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership program, which, as most of you might know, is the only program of its kind in Canada. And he is also the author of several major research reports. I'm going to turn this over to you, Keith, to introduce Dr. Phillips and to go over the format for today. And, you know, once again, I just thank you so much for attending and for being here for good with us. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Today's event is scheduled to end at 11 o'clock. Dr. Phillips's presentation will be approximately 25 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer period, which we invite all of you to participate in. A few housekeeping items. A reminder that this event is being recorded and will be posted on the university website and social media for public viewing. All participants' microphones and cameras are turned off. They will be activated during the question and answer period for those who wish to pose a question by video or audio. And I would ask you to either type your questions directly into the chat box or indicate that you have a question, and we'll call upon you to ask your question with video or audio. And now onto our formal programming. As chair of the Advisory Council of the Masters in Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership Program at Carleton, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Susan Phillips. Dr. Phillips is a professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton and the founder and director of its Master of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership. She is editor-in-chief of Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, the leading international journal focusing on nonprofits, philanthropy, and civil society. Susan is currently leading study teams examining the vulnerability and resilience of Canadian charities and the changing roles of philanthropy in response to COVID-19. And with that, I'll pass it over to Susan Phillips.
Thank you, Keith. And thank you for your leadership for the Masters in Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership and your tireless work as a volunteer for Carleton University. And thank you for all of you for joining us today. Canada and the world is at an important moment, a critical juncture when all the familiar ways of life, both big and small, work, study, family, travel, going to the hairdresser, sending kids to camp, they've all been disrupted. And it's time not just to figure out how we get through the pandemic, but how to build and reinvent many of these systems, making them stronger, better, and more just. Never waste a good crisis, a line that's simultaneously been attributed to Churchill, Saul Alinsky and Rules for Radicals, Machiavelli, and Tim Broadhead, has wide resonance. And I'm going to use that idea to apply to Canada's charitable and nonprofit and philanthropic sector, which has been so severely hit by COVID-19. How do we use this time to rebuild better? So my aim is to address some of the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead created by COVID and other events. I'll tell you about some of the research we're doing in the Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership Program, which is very much a team effort, but I'll also draw on reports from the sector in Canada and international. Carleton has been a hub for research on philanthropy and the nonprofit sector ever since we created the Masters in 2013 and indeed before that. And Carleton invested in faculty, invested in postdoctoral fellows, and in graduate students. We have some 150 graduates from that program, many of whom are on leadership ladders or in leadership positions. And we're delighted that I know some of you have joined us today. We're working on a couple of projects, working on many projects, but one is a 4-year project funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council on vulnerabilities and resilience in the charitable sector, working with my colleague Nathan Grassi and an international team. And a second one, we're working with Philanthropic Foundations of Canada, Community Foundations of Canada, on how foundations are responding to the crisis. And I will draw on some of that work with my colleague Paloma Rago. All of this is intended to look at how we build a stronger charitable sector and more robust philanthropy. Now, when I say sector, I'm referring to about 170,000 organizations, likely more, 86,000 of which are registered charities and for which we have pretty good data. The rest are nonprofits for which we have very little data as a country. The sector, of course, provides a wide range of services. Its economic contribution is as important to GDP as the manufacturing sector or the extractive industries. And indeed, 1 in 10 full-time jobs in Canada is in the charitable sector, making it Canada's largest employer. And the sector provides not just services, but the very act of engaging and of participating, giving, volunteering, we know from a wide range of research is good for people and it's good for our society. Now, when I talk about the pandemic, we're really talking about 3 stages of COVID-19. Difficult to say how long each will last. The first, the acute stage, which we're in now, then moving to a recovery, and ultimately a rebuild stage. They're not discrete stages. And a key point I want to make is that we need to start rebuilding even when we're in the recovery stage. And in many respects, it will be harder to go from recovery to rebuild because it's more risky. It involves working out of our comfort zone and our old ways of doing things. It's also important to recognize that this isn't just one moment, the pandemic, but it's also the time that we need to address racial and Indigenous justice. And that movement has been taken hold in an important way, and it's amplifying, along with the pandemic, the need for systems change, for reinventing, not just recovery. So I want in this presentation to identify some of the existing fragilities and vulnerabilities of the sector so that we don't repeat them as we rebuild, and to turn that around to look at resilience and how do we build resilience. I will try, but I will probably not succeed, not to use the words that we hear so often of unprecedented and pivot and new normal. And you can catch me if I do. Now, COVID-19 didn't suddenly create dramatic change in Canada's charitable and nonprofit sector. Big tectonic shifts were already underway. Those include demographics leading to an impending leadership change, the imperative of greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, the role of technology, for example, in fundraising, and those of you who are fundraisers certainly have experienced that. Social finance, the tools where investors seek both a financial and a social return, is poised to bring large amounts of private capital into the sector. And big philanthropy, that is, foundations, major donors, that segment of our society was already under some serious scrutiny due to income inequality, under quite vociferous criticism in the US, and some of that was starting to waft north, although I would make the case that philanthropy in Canada is not a mirror image of the US. So many of these changes were already in motion, and they have been amplified and accelerated by COVID-19. So let's look at some of the existing vulnerabilities to make sure we don't repeat them. And I'm going to talk about 3: financial, human resources, and policy neglect. Now, most charities depend on a mix of revenues, donations, government contracts and contributions, and earned income through the sale of goods and services. That mix varies depending on the subsector, but there was already a general instability baked into the system. And let me give you a few ways. Philanthropy has actually been stagnant for years, being more concentrated among a smaller and older cadre of people. That applies to both giving and volunteering. And while the overall level of charitable donations may have stayed relatively stable, that's because of a few large gifts. But in general, high net worth households are not giving to their ability, their capacity to do so, and in fact give a lower percentage of their wealth and income than do middle and lower income households. And we've certainly seen with COVID a loss of wealth, extensive unemployment. So we can expect that retail philanthropy, that is individual giving, will be set back for some time. And I know Keith has some data on changes in wealth. Another aspect of the financial side is that government contracts, which are a large part of revenues for a large part of the sector, rarely cover 100% the actual cost of those services, even when they are important public services. So what happens? Charities need to cross-subsidize. They cross-subsidize from donations or from earned income. And that can create some risky financial behavior, but it certainly leads to them being very stretched. Now, ironically, during COVID, we may find that the charities that fare better are those that are actually more dependent on government. But we certainly can't count on that in the long run. There's also been a starvation cycle built into the sector. It derives from the popular but mistaken idea that the more efficient and more effective charities and nonprofits are those that have low overhead costs relative to their program. So low administration, fundraising, and other overhead costs. Funders tend not to like to fund those, and neither do donors. Charities themselves often make this situation worse when they say 100% of the donations go to the program, without saying that that happens because somebody volunteered or otherwise covered the support for fundraising and for administration. What that means is that we've built in a systematic way of underinvesting in technology, in training, in people, all the things that promote innovation and resilience. And charities, as a result, have very limited reserves. Very few have more than 3 months. And there's been a growing sense that if charities have reserves, why do they need to fundraise? Therefore, enhancing that instability. So the point is, as we look to how we rebuild, we've got some issues on the financial side that we need to overcome. There are also human resource issues. The pandemic has pulled back the curtain on the gendered nature of this sector. 70% of the sector of employees are women, and the implications of precarious work, of contract, short-term, project-based work, particularly for racialized and immigrant women, and particularly for those working in long-term care. Now, again, this isn't a new revelation. The Ontario Nonprofit Network has been leading a decent work agenda for years, but it's been amplified during COVID. So we have precariousness at sort of the one end of the spectrum, but we also have a churn that is likely to happen among the leadership cadre. Even before, several years ago, the percentage of executive directors who were near, at, or indeed beyond normal retirement age was significant. More probably, I think the estimate is about 40% of the sector. And the vulnerability comes from the fact that there hasn't been a pipeline, succession planning, and talent development, and creating the new kinds of skills we need. That's one of the reasons we created the MP&L. And I suspect, we don't have good data on it, that we are likely to see more leadership churn as a result of the pandemic. The third area is related to policy neglect and a lack of public awareness. And in some sense, this is the greatest vulnerability for the sector. There's a lack of understanding in governments, for the most part, an absence of machinery. There's no home in government as there is for business or industry. And there's limited policy outside of charity regulation. Now, I think some of this is benign. It comes from a lack of understanding. There are too many silos, a focus on accountability. And it's compounded by a lack of public awareness of the sector. Studies from the US show that people can name a few brands, and they're the same brands, and they're the big organizations. What that means is we don't have a strong political constituency for the sector. It's true that the Senate committee produced a really important report about a year ago, and many in the sector, including me, are hoping that that is acted on. But it's also telling that when curbed, the the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit was initially planned and about to be rolled out for small business, it didn't include charities and nonprofits. We didn't think of them as employers. Government didn't think of them employers in the same way. And they were brought into the scheme by the quick advocacy of sector leaders. Now, talking about vulnerability is kind of the negative side of this. So let's flip that over to say what makes for resilience. And there is, and has long been, an amazing degree of innovation and ability to carry on in spite of those vulnerabilities in the sector. Now, the evidence is mixed, and some of the evidence from crises in the past doesn't necessarily apply to the current pandemic. What we know in terms of what helps resilience is there's no clear pattern on revenue diversity. The mantra that the way forward is to diversify your revenue sources. And I think we've come to the consensus that depends. It depends on the stability of your revenue sources, the sector, et cetera. Certainly reserves and having unrestricted funding that cover operational costs helps enormously. But the important factor in resilience is agility, the ability to understand and scan the environment. Leadership, particularly important, is the role of the board in being strategic. And some capacity to experiment. That is, you have some at least a modest amount of redundancy, or what was coined in looking at the success of firms in the early 1960s is having some slack so that you're not always simply fighting the fires. And of course, the people in this sector are amazing. So let's look at how that resilience then plays out in the 3 stages of the pandemic. In the crisis stage, the short term, which is probably not so short term, we know fundraising revenues stopped, earned income evaporated, venues closed. 75% of Canadian charities, according to an Imagine Canada study, are experiencing lost revenues, about 30%. 1 in 5 is already in financial trouble, and 45% are pessimistic about the future. Now, others, health charities, food banks, are experiencing increased demand, and donations seem to be flowing. There's, of course, the challenges of volunteers, in particular in services of community care that rely on older volunteers who are more vulnerable during the pandemic, or in women who have now the pressure of double duty with children at home. These effects are widespread across the sector: arts and culture organization, faith, sports, international, and of course, human services. And charities are responding, how they deliver, how they work, particularly the use of more greater technology. We're all zoomed out, no doubt. The projection, again by Imagine Canada, which is likely an optimistic one, is as much as 15 billion could be lost from the nonprofit sector, resulting in about 100,000 layoffs. Now, the government wage supports, the curve has certainly helped. And it's also important, though, when we look at these negative effects, to recognize there is some good news from Canada. People trusted expertise, they trusted science, and we trusted our governments, and for the most part, we stayed home. And an informal movement of caremongering, in which neighbors help neighbors, arose early on and appears to have been sustained. And we're now have additional political activism that will change our systems with the racial and Indigenous justice movement. So as we look to recovery, what we have, of course, the short term of being able to reopen and rehire staff, volunteers return. Some of the smaller organizations may come out of hibernation. But still, the prediction is 1 in 5 will permanently close. And those predictions seem to fit with elsewhere from UK, Australia, likely to lose 1 in 4 arts organizations. And some predict that as much as 40% of the sector of charities and nonprofits could be gone. In terms of employment, an important issue will be whether there is a ramp off from the wage subsidies or if it's like a cliff, which will have very difficult effects. We can anticipate in that recovery stage that overhead ratios will increase. You need to invest in technology. There will be expanded needs for operations, and those will need to be recognized by the regulator and by donors. Foundations are stepping up, and this is a really positive sign. Our study with philanthropic foundations and community foundations of Canada, where we have a panel of 22 foundation leaders, private foundations, community, corporate, and donor advised funds that we're going to follow for 6 months. It's early days, but foundations and donor advised funds do appear to be stepping up. They're granting more, they're making larger grants, they're more flexible in their terms, and they're faster. They seek to collaborate with other funders, with business, and with governments. They want to be more risk-taking and innovative going forward, looking forward to systems change over the long run. But finding the right projects can be challenging, avoiding duplication of community supports, and having the right information, evidence, data, and particularly for the smaller ones, professionalization just having people is an important issue. And their challenge, I think, while they're responding in the acute and the recovery stages, will be how to move forward from recovery to rebuild, where it takes much more different ways of working. So let's look forward to that rebuild and reinvent stage. Now, we should have learned from COVID-19 that we shouldn't make predictions because we're so likely to be wrong, but I'll try anyway. And certainly what seems evident is that simple recovery back to the status quo at the end of 2019 is not enough. And during this time, as we look to recover, I think there are several dynamics at play. Maybe we go back to the last slide. Those dynamics are, first of all, public trust. Public trust is essential to this sector for donors, for volunteers, for using the services, and it's been relatively high in recent years, although with a slight decline. COVID-19 created a sharp spike in public trust for governments and in science, at least in Canada. On the other hand, we're all forced to be a little suspicious, particularly of anyone who isn't wearing a mask. What will happen to public trust post-COVID? Will we reorient our social networks to kin and to cliques for a long period of time, thereby reducing broader public trust? Or will we continue to focus on evidence and trust in that evidence, amplifying the need for data and for demonstration of impact? The other dynamic is a renewal of the importance of place. We've been accustomed to staying home, buying locally, and perhaps even giving locally. The effects of the pandemic are felt quite differently in different places, urban and rural in different cities. And the geography of need is likely to be place dependent as charities in some communities get hollowed out differentially from other places. Work in the UK has already referred to that as the creation of charity deserts in certain places, perhaps charity oases in others. And we've seen community mobilization. Again, that neighbor helping neighbor, grassroots activism, and most of that has been place focused. Community foundations and United Ways are important supports in this, and they're part of delivering the community support funds. So what will happen with a renewal of place for this sector? Will there be a stronger role for municipal governments, more invigorated grassroots action, greater attention to membership and engagement with communities, broad communities by nonprofits, more focus on community relationships by foundations? I certainly don't have the answers of that, but I think that place will have a new dynamic. And there's also a paradox in that. As if we become too focused on place, how do we build the mobilization for cross-sector action for big issues like climate change and for work internationally? So we need to better understand the ecology of local systems and to do more sophisticated place-based analysis. We also need not to lose sight, which we've parked for a while, the big issue of climate change, and add to that the racial justice movement and the value of care that's been exposed by the pandemic. as we look to reinvent many of our care systems, all of which point to the imperative for systems change. So what will be required at the reinvention stage? Well, at minimum, it involves addressing the existing vulnerabilities through funding reform, other recommendations of the Senate report, but that won't be enough in my view. In terms of organizations and service delivery, we're likely to see a rethinking of the role of charities versus governments and a stronger safety net, a stronger public safety net, publicly supported safety net. We'll certainly see a revolution of technology and digital, AI, robotics, etc. New organizational forms, which may be more mutuals, more networked approaches, particularly as millennials and the Gen Zs come into leadership positions. In terms of giving, I think we can expect the donors will want to fix problems, really fix problems this time. They'll want to know that organizations are working together, that there's not duplication, they really are advancing solving problems. I think they want to be more informed with better information, more guidance from wealth advisors, and kudos to the work that CAGP is doing in this. I suspect that perpetuity and endowments will become even more in question. Will we see a decline of organizational and donor egoism? Perhaps names on our buildings matter less. And we may see a tension of that localism and globalism I talked about. I think we will see the need to support community mobilization and public engagement, a stronger local infrastructure, organizations paying more attention to their quote members or their constituencies. And again, the millennials and the Gen Zs, who have been the core of the racial justice protests, won't rely on organizations as we've known. That was already happening, but again, I think it will be accelerated. And we'll need to address inclusion in meaningful ways in our boards, in our staff, in who and how we serve. We'll need policy reinvention within all levels of government and within the sector. Machinery in government finding a home, a deeper understanding, a more coordinated engagement. Visible, stronger sector leadership. The sector leadership has done well, but we need to strengthen that locally, provincially, as well as nationally. And importantly, a facilitating factor is greater capacity for innovation and R&D in the sector. More than ever, we need data of all kinds, and analysis of what works. We need that at scale, we need it in a collaborative way, and we need to apply and mobilize that research. We need talent and skills development. We will need new skills in this sector. And that will require support from government, from private foundations, from philanthropists, which appears to be emerging, certainly for the acute phase and likely for the recovery phase, but it'll take a different kind of engagement for the rebuild phase, taking risks, being bold, looking at systems, working with communities in new ways. So in conclusion, these are indeed unprecedented times. They're difficult times, no doubt, and with what will likely be a smaller charitable nonprofit sector. But it's also a time of opportunity to rebuild and do things differently and more effectively. And when I look to the reinvention stage, I'm actually quite optimistic. And it's because of our youth. The millennials and the Gen Zs will lead change. They may have a tougher time than their baby boomer grandparents who could lead change in a time of rising expectations and lifting economies. But they are audacious thinkers and doers, and change will happen. And the rest of us need to facilitate that, not get in the way of it. And finally, I want to say that Carleton has been such an important perch, an important place to facilitate this work. And I'm delighted that I've spent my career here. You know, the university itself came out of community leadership in 1942, when they were looking forward to what would happen at the war. Again, we needed to reinvent, and we've never lost that connection to community. We have an advantage within the university that we're quite capable and interested in working in a cross-disciplinary way. We created a program for this sector, and now we're working on creating a much stronger R&D capacity for the sector, working with nonprofit and philanthropic leaders. And now is the time time to do this. We need data and evidence and analysis more than ever. You might ask, what is data? Well, we'll need to know about charitable giving. How does it recover? Where does it go? What do reconfigured charitable ecosystems look like? How do they meet community needs? How do we have greater impact? We need evidence to guide new financial models for charities and help them be resilient. We'll need to support policy guidance. We need to provide charities with skilled personnel that they'll need for the future. So we intend this work will be a hub for good, and that some of you might join us. So thank you, and I'm happy to discuss. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks very much, Susan. That was thought-provoking, to say the least. Just as people get ready to put their questions to you, as you know, our firm looks at the wealth of Canadians, and at the end of 2019, Canadian personal wealth was $5 trillion. And by the end of March this year, about 300 billion had been erased from that. And we're now seeing trends towards slightly increased household debt, concerns about income, concerns about the sustainability of retirement income. Do you expect that Canadian donors are going to change direction as the result of the new financial pressures that we're seeing, and the new course that really has appeared quite suddenly?
That's a really important question, and again, it's hard to know, and I'm sure there are people joining us who have better data than I do. What usually happens in disasters is that people give to the disaster, but they don't stop giving to other things. The disaster doesn't drain away from other things. What's different in this time is that, as you're saying, is that loss of real wealth and unemployment. So I suspect that we will see a long-term, several years at least, effect of a dampening of giving. We may see more in bequests, but that regular giving is imperiled for the average donor, which means that other parts of the system need to step up.
Yeah. All right, Susan, we have a question from a participant, and I'll read it to you. Here's from a charity. As we look ahead to the transition and reinvention stages, we're thinking about our fundraising strategy. The question we have is whether we change our communications and fundraising strategy to relate it and our work more closely to the pandemic. And it's a non-healthcare related nonprofit organization. Or do we continue with our normal communication strategy because we continue to think that our work is important and deserves support?
That's a really good question. And we certainly have seen during COVID a focus on health and on food security, for example, as key to mental health, as the key source of donations. I think people want to give more broadly to the extent that they can, and the challenge is knowing where to direct what the other needs are, where to direct their donations. When I talked about maybe we'll have less egoism, in that we'll have, as we look to how we really help our society recover and how we take that forward, we're not sticking to our old favorite pet charities and causes, that we seek to broaden our support. And the challenge will be knowing what else is out there. So there's an information deficit, I would say, and therefore when you're in something other than health and food banks and the immediate need, I think you need to continue reinforcing that message. So I know there are fundraisers, experienced fundraisers who could add more to this, but I don't think you pervert what, or not pervert is, you don't switch what you do or your messaging. I think we need to communicate those other needs, and there are donors out there who want to support those other needs still. But the missing link is information.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to another question here from Linda Bryson. You mentioned the millennials and Gen Zs will become more involved to help solve the problem, which can mean a brand new organization with not such a brand new idea. How can we discourage throwing the baby out with the bathwater and engage them to work with existing charities to accomplish their goals rather than starting from the beginning again?
Good question, Linda, and I'm pleased to hear from you. Linda's a graduate of our program and a leader in the sector. How existing organizations work in a truly inclusive way, now is the time we need to change. The expectations, first of all, the sector hadn't been that good at diversity, equity, and real inclusion. It was starting to change, but now that needs to be ramped up, because the expectations of different ways of working, of real engagement are much higher. So now is the time to engage with the millennials and the Gen Zs, and to figure out what it takes to really involve them in leadership roles, leadership pipelines, in both volunteer roles in the board and in staff. So old organizations won't disappear, they need to work differently, but I think we'll see a whole new layer of more informal, other more casual, networked, pop-up kind of organizations or quasi-organizations that complement the more standard ones.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question, Susan. In light of COVID-19 and pending economic recession, which subsectors within the not-for-profit and charity sector are likely to face increased demand for services? And do you have any thoughts about immediate increases compared to the medium or longer term as a result of potential lag effects?
Well, those that are immediate, that are impacted in the acute phase, we're seeing healthcare, mental health, income, food security, food banks in particular, all of those that are kind of addressing the displacement of employment and the insecurity that goes with that. The ones that are going to, but the effects are much wider. Arts organization, all those organizations that depended on events and venues that have closed. Churches. There's an interesting report by the Council of Christian Churches showing that they too, because they haven't been able to bring congregations together, are suffering, particularly in rural areas. So part of what I'm saying is we have immediate needs in the acute phase, and the challenge will be how we learn about, how we build the information component to help that the broader sector and the investment in infrastructure that will help us rebuild infrastructure across the sector and infrastructure within charities and nonprofits.
Thank you. We have a question from Tim Broadhead. Can the sector shift from its traditional service orientation, and he's put clients in inverted commas, to an empowered community approach, sometimes referred to as decolonizing philanthropy?
That's why I say we're at two moments that have converged. The pandemic, I think in itself, would have reinforced and has reinforced our need for services for helping vulnerable communities, and that is more of the kind of traditional charity philanthropic model. But the justice movement is one of empowerment. It's not serving; it is empowering communities. It's finding different ways of doing things and systems change, and that's why I think it's such a powerful moment. Those two have come together. So it will not be just enhancing services. It will be how we work with communities of all kinds, geographic, social, and involve youth and diverse segments of those communities in more of a community philanthropy, community engagement, community empowerment model. And from a research perspective, we're probably behind some of the innovation that has happened in practice in that, frankly. So we have a lot of learning to do all around, and it'll be quick learning. We need to move quickly.
Okay, thank you, Susan. I think we've got time for one more question here, and it's a topic close to my heart. Can you speak to how you see mergers within the sector and deeper governance integrations playing out over the medium term, say the next few years, due to pressure from the pandemic?
We're already seeing mergers, interest in mergers, the need for mergers, and as part of that, the important factor in resilience and change is governance, is strategy and governance. I think boards will need to step up and to work in more strategic ways. It may be even harder to recruit board members, but they will have an even more critical role in how we move forward. But I think there's no questions that there are mergers, and I think we'll see some pressures from funders and donors. They say, now is the time to make real change. We don't want, we need to know how we get organizations working together so that we can understand how to have the greatest impact in a collective way. So I think, and the trick for funders will be to do that in a constructive way as opposed to a hammer way.
Yeah, so you see donors and foundations actually coming together to enable a bigger gift, maybe to support a particular cause.
We're certainly, from the foundation study we're doing, we're already seeing that foundations are collaborating with other foundations. There's a certain frustration of being able to know how to have the biggest bang in the community by ensuring that organizations are working together. But the funders are already coming together. That's in the acute phase. They need to keep doing that as we move forward into the rebuild phase.
Okay. I think that we've got one more question. It's called a quick question. So what do you think the effects on employment for new graduates will mean for the long-term health of the sector? And how can we ensure that new young talent is not overlooked in the crisis, resilience, and recovery stages? That sounds like a good question to end with.
It sounds like a question someone from our program should ask and would ask. We were already on the verge of a major leadership change by demographics alone. And because we don't have good data in the sector, we're not sure how that will play out. But there may be a small percentage of existing leaders who stay on because they too took an economic hit. But I suspect there's going to be real leadership churn. People reassess the course of their lives and and people exit the leadership positions. So the opportunities for employment, for getting on that leadership ladder, and it's going to take different kinds of skills. It's going to take those who work with digital platforms, who understand technology, who understand collaboration and networks, who work with communities, who are strategic and change makers. And I think there's going to be a real thirst for that, a real need for that. And so I'm actually very optimistic. It may take getting them through the acute and then the recovery stage, but even in that recovery stage, there's going to be enormous opportunity, I think.
Great. Okay, Susan, I think that it's time for us to pass the baton back to Jennifer Connolly, but I'd have to say that it's been a very thought-provoking conversation, and we've seen a lot of comments on the chat saying how helpful your comments have been to the participants. So with that, Jennifer, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Keith, and thank you, Dr. Phillips, for your insightful presentation. Now, despite how busy you are with our Masters in Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership program and your own research, we will beg you to come back and chat with us again, please, and host this type of important conversation. I think the response from those who attended, the incredible questions that are being asked, are strong indicators that leaders in our sector need to continue this conversation. So we will ask you at another date to come back, reassure, give us some evidence-based insight and some research for our path forward. Thanks again, Dr. Phillips. A reminder that we hosted today's event in our brand new Hub for Good. I invite you to check out the hubforgood.carleton.ca. We're building partnerships with purpose, and we would love to have you as a partner. You know, an example of the resources that you can access through our Hub for Good is the support afforded to Ottawa-based charities and nonprofits in the Crisis Management and Recovery Program at the Sprott School of Business here at Carleton University. This unique program is offered at no charge to small and medium enterprises and nonprofit organizations to help them respond to the current challenges. Really highly trained teams of our extraordinary students work under the supervision of our talented faculty, and they can provide you with advice and strategy on how to manage through this immediate crisis and then towards resilience, recovery, and reinvention. So please, let's partner, hubforgood.carleton.ca. We are all so grateful that you joined us today and participated and started this important conversation with Carleton University, home to the only Masters in Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership program in Canada, and an important place for emerging research about our sector that serves Canadian society. So from my remote office, otherwise known as my kitchen, to yours, wherever that may be, I wish you and we wish you a wonderful day, and we look forward to being together for good with you. Good day, everyone. Thank you.